Nazi concentration camps hide within their walls the most sinister acts that humanity has ever known. And Bergen-Belsen, in northern Germany, was no exception. This was the first to be liberated by Allied forces. Until then, the only descriptions of what happened in these places were from the Red Army, made up of soldiers from the Soviet Union who had seen with their own eyes the horrors of these temples of death established within Poland. The combatants knew that the Third Reich was brutal in battle, but they found it hard to believe some of the stories told by Stalin's men. However, to their surprise, what they found was even worse. Possibly the concentration camps of World War II were the scene of the most atrocious crimes of humanity. And in this new video, we will go through the history of one of the most fearsome. We warn you, the images and stories that we are going to see in the next few minutes are incredibly brutal. But if you're ready to discover everything that the victims of the Bergen-Belsen camp endured, including one well-known figure who died there, then sit back, because we're already getting started.
Wreszcie najstraszniejszy, najokropniejszy obóz, jaki przeżyłem, to jest Bergen-Belsen. Sceny nie do opisania. Chcąc uwierzyć, trzeba być na miejscu i wszystko widzieć. Trupy, trupy i jeszcze raz trupy.
The Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler always had concentration camps among its tools, which were created in 1933 as facilities to guard and restrict the freedom of the enemies of the Führer's ideology. At first, the paramilitary organization of the Third Reich, known as the SS and led by Heinrich Himmler, detained mostly political opponents, largely members of the Communist Party, and to them were added criminals, the so-called asocials who did not identify with any thought, and some Jews. That was the basis for the structure that would take on great relevance after the outbreak of the Second World War. However, each camp also has its own particular history, and in this case, we will learn about that of Bergen-Belsen. In 1935, 4 years before the start of the war, its facilities were used to test the range and autonomy of the deadly German armored vehicles. The two small towns between which it was located gave its name to the place that fell into disuse between 1938 and 1939. However, when the Nazis invaded Poland, the German armed forces, better known as the Wehrmacht, began using the space as a camp for prisoners of that particular conflict. Its facilities quickly became full. There were a large number of detainees, which required a lot of work and represented several mouths to feed. Before the full-scale war with the rest of Europe began, this center housed 95,000 men, including opponents of Nazism, communists, homosexuals, gypsies, and even Jehovah's Witnesses. As if that were not enough, in June 1940, when Hitler's famous Lightning War, or Blitzkrieg, began to dominate much of the territory around Germany, Bergen-Belsen housed the first French and Belgian prisoners. A year later, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the camp had to expand its facilities and was already beginning to show Nazi brutality.
Approximately 2,500 Russians died at this camp in a one-month period. One bit of sport which the Nazi commandant indulged in was to turn loose German police dogs for attacks on the physically handicapped who were unable to report promptly for the daily inspection.
Although the camp's capacity had been expanded, the number of people arriving meant that the camp could never cope, and overcrowding was common. The new design was designed to hold 20,000 prisoners, but it was quickly overwhelmed. By the end of March 1942, 41,000 detainees had already died in the complex, from the Soviet Union alone. They were victims of hunger, exhaustion, and disease, but Bergen-Belsen remained outside the initiative that was called the Final Solution. This was the Nazi plan to eliminate all the Jews in Europe, which used gas chambers as the main means to achieve its goal. However, the camp we are referring to did not have one of them. In fact, the operation was different in terms of dealing with this specific population that was intended to be annihilated. While in places like Auschwitz, transports of Jews arrived ready to be taken to their death by poisoning with a powerful pesticide that was used in the chambers. What happened in Bergen-Belsen was that Jews were housed to be exchanged for civilians, or German soldiers, who had been captured by the enemy. Between the summer of 1943 and December 1944, at least 14,600 Jews were transported to this camp. They were all forced to work in the war efforts of the Third Reich. They were slave labor, at first not too badly treated because the Nazis saw in these detainees a particular and potential exchange value. However, consideration had a limit for the supposed kindness of the Nazis. Within the complex, they had created a space called recovery. It was a great irony, since prisoners too sick to work were sent there from other concentration camps. The intention, at least formally, was to restore strength and health in order to return to their forced labor as soon as possible. But most of them died in Bergen-Belsen from hunger, exhaustion, and lack of medical attention for their ailments.
Some have gangrenous wounds. Others suffer from fever, tuberculosis, typhus, and additional communicable diseases. All existed under appalling conditions in vermin-infested quarters and with little or nothing to eat.
By 1944, part of the facilities had been adapted to house a women's camp, which received an initial shipment of 9,000 prisoners. Many of them very young girls, almost all deported after the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest confinement space for Jews established by Nazi Germany. Other women also arrived from the rest of Poland and Hungary. They were all destined to work in the manufacture of weapons to support the troops of the Third Reich. But the changes in the camp did not only occur among the detainees and new inmates. In December of that same year, the first commander of Bergen-Belsen, Adolf Haas, was replaced by another member of the SS who had been the greatest authority in Auschwitz. This was Josef Kramer, who was a true expert in the task of murdering prisoners. He arrived prepared to face a reality that had been experienced for some time: the entry of prisoners in droves in a complex too small to house them all. He thus decided to eliminate as many of them as possible as a solution to his problem, easily summarizing the cruelty of the Germans. These images show, without leaving any room for doubt, that this type of complex housed the most aberrant acts in history. It was with Kramer as commander that Bergen-Belsen ceased to be considered simply a facility to house prisoners, and officially became a Nazi SS concentration camp. Under his guidance, the facilities were expanded again. However, by January 1945, the camps in Eastern Europe began to be evacuated in the face of the advance of the Red Army, and at least 85,000 people were transported in cattle cars to the complex in Germany. Many were sent on foot, but a large part were unable to withstand the long and hard march due to their state of deterioration caused by their stay in the camps of the Third Reich. As if that were not enough, those who arrived had to continue fighting for their lives. Bergen-Belsen had become a hell where everything was prepared to kill you. From the lack of food and hygiene, the brutality of the guards, and even the diseases and the doctors who, far from alleviating these illnesses, experimented on the prisoners. All of this was recorded in the memory of the people who managed to escape this hell alive, and who had the opportunity to tell their torment after being released.
Wir waren 1500 in einem Zimmer, sehr schmutzig und sehr gedrängt haben wir sich. Und ohne Essen, ohne Wasser und überhaupt, das war kein Leben für uns. Wir haben gedacht, dass wir schon das Überleben nicht mehr.
Only those who overcame all these obstacles could have any hope of seeing with their own eyes the fall of Nazism, which was drawing ever closer. To put into perspective the last months of chaos in Bergen-Belsen before the end of the war, we can look at some numbers. In February 1945, there were approximately 22,000 prisoners in the camp. But with the arrival of detainees evacuated from the compounds on the front lines of the conflict where the enemy was advancing, by mid-April the figure had exceeded 60,000 people. Furthermore, we must bear in mind that in the same period, tens of thousands died, so the total number of victims of Nazi cruelty around this camp was close to around 100,000 people, just in this small stretch of history, which ended on April 15, 1945, with the arrival of British forces. This was how Allied troops liberated a concentration camp from the Nazis for the first time.
Während wir Sie durch dieses Lager führen, müssen Sie sich zwei Dinge von Augen halten. Erstens, dass wir, die Engländer, bereits 10 Tage hier gewesen sind. Wir hoffen, alle Toten aus den Baracken fortgeschafft zu haben.
The second was to enlist the help of the SS guards to obtain information about what was happening in this hellish place. Although they had already formed an idea in their minds just by entering and finding a place full of corpses, as well as thousands of other prisoners who could barely move to distinguish themselves from the dead. An emblematic example of this was the case of the Hungarian artist Katharina Hardy. The violinist had been captured for being Jewish and was in Bergen-Belsen when the British forces broke in. When the soldiers found her, the young woman, barely 16 years old at the time, weighed 29 kilos. She was lying on the floor with her legs bent and could not stretch them or have the energy to get up. She was also unable to swallow, and therefore it was impossible for her to eat. She had been in this state for weeks and was quickly transferred to a military hospital. There she was able to regain some weight and begin to improve. She managed to be one of the survivors and avoid being just another number among the victims for whom these Nazis now had to answer.
Heute ist der 23. April 1945. Ich bin der Oberscharführer, der SS-Oberscharführer Friedrich Herzog aus Dortmund in Westfalen und bin 2 Jahre hier im Lager.
Men like this went from being guards to prisoners of the Allied forces and accused of the greatest atrocities. In fact, Katharina Hardy herself, once she recovered, explained what it was like to be locked up in the concentration camp. Life was not normal. Death was normal. I don't see the world as others see it. In reality, I belong to the dead of Bergen-Belsen. The woman thought that there was a palpable presence of the afterlife, due to the fact that she saw corpses everywhere, every day, in addition to constant shootings to execute those who could no longer perform forced labor, and the guards decided to kill. Life was the exception in this complex, and that fact impacted and transformed all the prisoners who passed through there. Another example comes from the testimony of Gina Turgel, a Polish citizen who managed to avoid the gas chamber at Auschwitz, but was sent to Bergen-Belsen for her end. When we arrived, we were told to go into a huge empty hut with no beds, mattresses, or blankets, nothing. With openings for windows but no glass. We found a corner with my mother and fell asleep, exhausted. Early in the morning, I woke up and couldn't believe what I saw. Skeletons walking, in every sense of the word.
Montones
Piles
de
of
cuerpos
bodies piled
apilados,
up,
montañas.
mountains. You couldn't tell if they were women or men. It's hard to describe how terrible it was, she said. And the same story was repeated no matter who told it.
Es ist mir schwer zu beschreiben, das alles, was wir Häftlinge hier in den Lager mitgemacht haben. Als nur kleine Beweisen kann ich erzählen, dass man hat uns Häftlinge in einem schmutzigen, verlausten Lager auf der Erde geschmissen, Tausende auf eine nur Erde, ohne Decken, ohne Strohsäcke, ohne Betten. Man hat uns als Essen einen 12. Teil vom Brot gegeben, 1 Liter Steckrübensuppe täglich.
As mentioned above, this concentration camp was found to have about 60,000 people inside at the time of liberation. Most of these prisoners were seriously ill. Thousands of corpses remained unburied within the confines of the complex, and this was an attenuating factor for various ailments due to the unhygienic conditions. More than 10,000 of the detainees who were rescued were in such a state of disrepair that despite efforts to save them, they ended up dying. Although they were released, the Germans were responsible and were forced by British forces to remedy this by working to care for the fragile victims.
The staff of German nurses is also forced to attend the victims. The women are able to smile for the first time in years.
The darkest period seemed to have ended for these female prisoners, but the consequences would accompany them for life, since they had been the target of brutal sterilization experiments. The Nazi plan was to prevent the Jewish population from continuing to procreate, either between couples or as a result of cruel rape by German guards, who subjected them to constant sexual abuse. The SS doctors were aware of Adolf Hitler's desire to preserve his beloved Aryan race, and so they began to look for different methods to prevent Hebrew women from having children. Among them, overexposure to X-rays, surgeries or injections with chemical irritants that caused severe inflammation, causing enormous pain and permanent damage to the reproductive organs were tested. In addition to all this suffering, many times the test subjects were killed to perform autopsies and compare results in different bodies. Now, women were not the only ones to suffer, because the Germans managed to have punishments for each of the prisoners. In fact, these were not the only stories that came to light after the liberation of this fearsome concentration camp.
Demonstrating how the victims were tied up for administering vicious beatings. A barbed wire stick was used on the backs of the men. Another method for rendering a patriot helpless while he was attacked by his Gestapo guards.
The torture at Bergen-Belsen was on a par with any other German concentration camp. But it must be remembered that this was the first camp to be liberated by Allied troops, so it was also the one that uncovered the brutal mysteries of the Nazi treatment of its prisoners. Soviet soldiers of the Red Army had already had contact with other complexes in occupied territories when they advanced from Eastern Europe. But the Western forces that began their journey towards Germany after the Normandy landings on French soil were still unaware of what was happening behind closed doors in these factories of death. For this reason, when they discovered it, the Americans led by General Dwight Eisenhower wanted to show the world the brutality that was taking place behind closed doors.
Former inmates demonstrate how they were tortured by the Nazis. American congressmen invited to view the atrocities were told by General Eisenhower, "Nothing is covered up. We have nothing to conceal. The barbarous treatment these people received in the German concentration camps is almost unbelievable. I want you to see for yourselves and be the spokesman for the United States."
By this time, the war was practically over. Just 2 weeks after the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen camp, Adolf Hitler took his own life to avoid being captured by Stalin's troops who had already entered Berlin. All the secrets of the Führer's atrocious regime were beginning to be revealed, although on some occasions, the Germans themselves, who had been part of the extensive killing machinery, claimed not to be aware of what was happening inside the detention camps. That is why the Americans, who wanted to establish the brutal crimes committed, added Nazi soldiers to the tours of the recently liberated complex, confronting them with the truth so that, whether they knew what it was about or not, they could feel and smell the death they had caused with so much pain in between.
These two are identified as slave labor bosses who maltreated, tortured, and killed their workers. Next, to the woodshed, which the Nazis are reluctant to enter, but Colonel Sears demands that they get a close-up look at the most gruesome of sights.
The delegations, which included representatives of the American government and the Germans, new prisoners of war, toured every corner of the camp that for years had been a hell for tens of thousands of Jews from all over Europe. The completely consumed corpses were the clearest reflection of the suffering that had been part of the detainees in Bergen-Belsen. But little by little, they also became aware of the conditions they had had to face before wishing for death as an escape from profound suffering. Among the places visited, they came to the site that was specially prepared to burn the piles of lifeless bodies and reduce the number that accumulated throughout the complex.
They are taken to the crematory 2 miles outside the camp, where the list of the atrocities is read for all to hear. 4,000 Ordruf victims are said to include Poles, Czechs, Russians, Belgians, Frenchmen, German Jews, and German political prisoners.
If we leave out the early years of the camp's operation, when it served as a space for holding prisoners of war, either from invaded Poland or those brought in after the occupation from France and Belgium, it is estimated that between 1943 and 1945, around 120,000 people passed through Bergen-Belsen. However, only about 55,000 of them were ever known by name, less than half. This is because the SS destroyed much of the archives before the defeat of Nazism. Only a few reports that had been suppressed ended up in the hands of the Allies. And although the data was scarce, it offered some clarity for the families of Holocaust victims who were searching for their loved ones in the hope of finding them alive.
Death books found hidden in the wine cellar of the Hadamar Institution revealed part of the story of the mass killings. The bulky volumes contained thousands of death certificates. Profession unknown, nationality unknown was written after each name.
Many of the former SS personnel were tried by the British at the Bergen-Belsen trial. During the period that it operated as a concentration camp, at least 480 people worked as guards or staff members at the complex, including 45 women. From 17 September to 17 November 1945, some of them were tried by a military court in Lüneburg. This included Commandant Josef Kramer, 16 men from the Nazi forces, 16 female guards, and 12 former heads of the different camp sectors. Many of the defendants were not only accused of crimes committed at this particular camp, but also of previous transgressions at Auschwitz. Substantial media coverage of the trial provided detailed information about the gas chambers at this complex on Polish soil, as well as the mass murders at Bergen-Belsen. 11 of the defendants were sentenced to death, including Kramer, and their hangings took place on December 13, 1945, in Hamelin. On the other hand, 14 ended up acquitted. Finally, of the remaining 20, one was sentenced to life imprisonment, but executed for another crime. And for the remaining 19, prison terms of 1 to 15 years were imposed. However, most of these cases were reduced on appeals or requests for clemency. As we approach the end of our video, we can assure you that the sentences paid by this small group of Nazis sound like little compared to the terrible suffering experienced by thousands of prisoners in that atrocious place. And as promised, we will tell you who was the person who spent her last days in Bergen-Belsen. It is Anne Frank, the young woman who became famous for her story of her time escaping from the Nazis. She was locked up with her family for 25 months in the back of a house in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and during that time, she wrote in a diary the most shocking things about that period. Her dreams, fears, and the brutal uncertainty of knowing how it would all end. Finally, she and her family were captured in August 1944 and sent to Auschwitz, but later, Anne was transferred to the concentration camp on German soil, where she died in February 1945 due to typhus. Now, after having experienced German brutality in the service of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us. We look forward to seeing you in the next installment of Military History.